The ballroom did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a candle dies. One small surrender at a time, until there was nothing left but the dark. Sera Voss had spent 6 years in Ashvern House, making herself lustful enough to keep and invisible enough to ignore. She arranged correspondence no one thanked her for. She managed schedules no one acknowledged. She had learned, the way you learn anything that costs you daily, that usefulness and visibility were not the same thing. Tonight, the Duke of Ashvern had reminded her of exactly that. Miss Voss. His voice never rose. It simply arrived, low, precise, carrying the authority of a man who had never once needed to repeat himself. 200 heads turned. The Duchess's correspondence was to be prepared by 8 o'clock. It is now past. 200 pairs of eyes found her at once. Your Grace. She kept her voice quiet, which was what made the room lean in. The correspondence was completed at 7:15. Mr. Farrow misplaced it. She was supposed to stop there. 6 years of discipline told her to lower her chin, absorb it, and disappear into the nearest corridor the way she always disappeared. But something had broken open inside her chest. Quietly, entirely, and she could no longer find the piece of herself that still knew how to be small. "What I will not do," she said, in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, "is stand in the center of a ballroom and be spoken to as though I am a footman who has misplaced a tray. I have held this household together for 6 years while everyone in it looked directly through me. And I am finished pretending that is acceptable." Not a single glass clinked. Not a single chair scraped. The Duke's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite anger. Something closer to a man realizing, for the first time, that he has made an error he cannot yet calculate the cost of. "Your only duty," he said, low and absolute, "is to obey." Sera looked at him for one long, measured moment. Then she curtsied, perfectly, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. She had expected to feel shame or fear. What she felt instead, for the first time in 6 years, was herself. It would take the Duke 3 months to understand what he had lost. By then, she would already be gone. Not fled, not hiding, but simply, cleanly, irrevocably somewhere else. And no command in the world would bring her back. Chapter 1. There is a particular kind of invisibility that is not unkind. It is simply the way certain people are placed in certain rooms. Not to be looked at, but to be used. Sera had learned this in her first week at Ashvern House, and she had spent the 6 years since perfecting the art of it. She rose before the household stirred. She dressed in grey. She moved through the corridors the way water moves through cracks, finding the path of least resistance, leaving no mark. By the time the Duchess Helena opened her eyes each morning, Sera was already there, standing at the window with the curtains drawn just so, the tea poured to precisely the temperature Helena preferred, the day's letters sorted by urgency on the silver tray. Companion was the word they used. It was a soft word, a careful word. It implied friendship, closeness, the warmth of chosen company. What it meant, in practice, was this. Sera was the person who remembered everything, so that Helena didn't have to. She remembered which flowers made the Duchess sneeze. She remembered the names of Helena's estranged cousins, the ones who wrote every Christmas and never received a reply. She remembered the anniversary of the stillbirth that Helena never spoke of aloud, but observed every year, with 3 days of silence, and a single white candle lit in the east sitting room. Sera held those things the way the walls of Ashvern House held heat, quietly, constantly, without being thanked for it. Helena was not cruel. That was the thing people never quite understood when Sera tried, in rare unguarded moments, to explain her life here. The Duchess was charming, in fact, generous in her way. She laughed easily and touched Sera's arm when she said, "You are indispensable to me," and she meant it. the way one means it about a very good pair of gloves. It was the Duke who made the air in the house feel thin. Julian Ashvern did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had the particular stillness of a man who has never once in his life been told that something he wanted was unavailable. His authority was not formed. It was structural, architectural, built into every room he entered. Sera Voss straightened without being asked. Conversations shifted. The house itself seemed to exhale and make space for him. He had married Helena 7 years ago in a ceremony Sera had not attended. She had come to Ashvern House a year later, and by then, whatever warmth might have once existed between husband and wife had already settled into the arrangement they maintained now, civil, functional, and cold as the marble floors in the East Wing. Julian did not see Sera, not in the way that mattered. She passed him in the library on Tuesdays when she came to return Helena's books. He would be standing at the window, always the window, always looking outward, and he would nod slightly the way one nods at furniture that has been tastefully arranged. She would nod in return. Sometimes he said Miss Voss with the smooth neutrality of a man who had memorized the names of everyone in his household as a matter of management rather than interest. She told herself it did not bother her. She was lying. Not because she wanted Julian Ashvern to love her, or want her, or spin toward her like something caught in a current. She was not foolish, and she had long since learned the particular discipline of wanting nothing she could not have. What bothered her was simpler and stranger than longing. It was the suspicion gathering slowly over 6 years like sediment at the bottom of still water, that she had become invisible not just to him but to herself, that the labor of being useful had slowly, quietly replaced the labor of being known. At night, when Helena was asleep and the house had gone dark and enormous around her, Sera sat at the small desk in her small room and wrote letters she never sent. Letters to her sister in the north. Letters to the girl she had been before the money ran out, and the options narrowed, and a position as companion to a duchess had seemed like a kind of grace. She was not unhappy. She told herself that too. The candle burned low, the house creaked around her. All that stone, all that history, all those rooms full of beautiful things that belonged to someone else. And somewhere down the long corridor, behind a door that was always closed, Julian Ashvern did not sleep either. She did not know that yet. She would. Chapter 2. It happened on a Tuesday, because most things at Ashvern House happened on Tuesdays. That was the day Julian reviewed the estate. That was the day ledgers moved from desk to desk, reports were submitted, and the great machinery of Ashvern's holdings. The tenant farms, the timber contracts, the London accounts, turned over like a wheel that never fully stopped. Tuesdays had a particular texture in the house. Tighter, quieter. Even the kitchen spoke in lower voices. Sera was returning Helena's books to the library when Julian appeared in the doorway behind her, not quite entering the room. He rarely did when she was in it, and said, without preamble, that Mr. Farrow was unwell and the week's correspondence needed managing. He did not ask. Men like Julian did not ask. The sentence arrived already complete, already decided, carrying with it the faint expectation that the matter would be resolved before it became inconvenient. Sera said, of course, because that was what she said to everything, and Julian nodded once. That nod, the furniture nod, and was gone. She stood alone among the bookshelves for a moment, holding 3 volumes of didactical illustration against her chest, and breathed. Then she went to work. Mr. Farrow's office was a small, proud room off the east corridor, and it smelled of ink and self-importance in roughly equal measure. He was the estate secretary, a man of meticulous habit and considerable vanity, who organized his files by a system so ornate it had taken Sera 40 minutes just to understand the logic of it. She understood it by the second hour. The correspondence had backed up over 3 days of Farrow's illness. 17 letters. 6 requiring urgent reply. 2 involving a disputed boundary on the northern tenant land that had, she discovered, been incorrectly handled in the previous month's response. Farrow's response, in a way that had quietly inflamed the situation rather than resolved it. She stayed past dinner. She stayed past the hour when the lamps in the upper corridors were dimmed. She drafted, revised, cross-referenced lease agreements, consulted the surveyor's notes from 4 years prior that she found misfiled under miscellaneous, and wrote 6 replies so precise and so careful that she read them back twice, just to be certain. Nothing had been missed. Nothing had been missed. She sealed the letters herself, addressed them in her neat, undecorated hand, and placed them in the outgoing tray with a full summary, organized, annotated, of every outstanding matter and its recommended resolution. Then she went to bed at midnight and did not think about it again. Mr. Farrow returned on Friday. She heard him in the corridor, his voice restored and carrying, expressing gratitude to no one in particular for his recovery. She was with Helena at the time, reading aloud from a French novel the Duchess had declared magnificent and Sera privately found exhausting. She kept her place on the page. She did not look up. The staff review was held the following Tuesday. Julian conducted these with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Seated at the head of the long table in the estate room, papers before him, the senior staff arranged in a loose arc. Sera was not senior staff. She was not usually present. She was present this time because Helena had decided on a whim that she wished to raise the matter of the East Garden path before the full assembly rather than in private, and had brought Sera along to hold her notes and prompt her if she forgot the figure she'd been quoted by the groundskeeper. She stood near the wall. She held Helena's notes. She watched. The correspondence came up third on the agenda. Julian said that the backlog had been cleared with impressive efficiency, that the boundary matter in the north, a situation he called delicate, had been resolved without escalation, that whoever had handled the response had done so with what he described, in his most expansive possible register, as sound judgment. Mr. Farrow received this. He received it the way a man receives something he has been waiting for, with a small, composed smile and a slight incline of the head that managed to suggest both modesty and certainty that the praise was deserved. He says that the northern tenants had always required a particular approach, and that he was glad the matter had been put to rest. Julian said, "Good man," and made a note. The room moved on. Sera did not move, not outwardly. She remained exactly as she was, upright, hands folded over Helena's notes, eyes forward. A portrait of composure, the kind of composure that is indistinguishable from not having feelings at all, which she had spent 6 years perfecting, and which served her now the way armor serves someone who has already been struck. Helena, beside her, was thinking about the garden path. Sera could tell by the way she was organizing the paper in her hands, shuffling it with small preparatory movements. Helena had not been listening to the correspondence item. Helena rarely listened to anything that didn't concern her directly. This was not unkindness. It was simply the geometry of Helena's world, and Sera lived at its edges where the light was thinner. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "This is the whole of it, isn't it? Not the credit taken. Not even the erasure that had happened before, in smaller ways, in the daily arithmetic of invisible labor." What landed differently today was Julian's voice, the particular quality of his attention when he said sound judgment. She had heard him speak to Farrow and to the groundskeeper and to the solicitors from London, and she understood now. with the total understanding of a woman who had been watching someone for 6 years, that he was capable of seeing, of noticing, of registering the specific quality of another person's work. He simply had never aimed that capacity in her direction. Of course, she had said to him in the library. She would always say, of course, and he would always nod and leave, and the door would close and nothing would change, because she had never given him reason to believe that anything needed to. The garden path was raised. Sera provided the figure. The meeting continued. She stood at the wall and held Helena's notes and understood with a quietness that was almost peaceful that something in her was done. Not broken, not despairing, simply finished with a particular patience, finished with a particular smallness. The ballroom that evening would be full of people and candlelight and the low roar of a world performing itself. She would go. She would stand near the wall as she always did, and something would be different. She didn't yet know it would be him. Chapter 3. Julian Ashvern noticed the chair on a Wednesday, not the day after the ball. He had spent that day in meetings with the solicitors from London, and the day had the particular density of days that consume themselves entirely, leaving no room for peripheral observation. But Wednesday arrived with an unusual quiet, and he was crossing through the south corridor toward the library when he passed the small sitting room adjacent to Helena's suite and saw through the half-open door a chair that was empty in a way that struck him as wrong. He did not stop. He continued to the library. He sat at the desk. He opened the quarterly land report and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining a word of it. He set the report down. The chair was wing-backed, positioned near the window at the angle that caught the morning light. He had walked past that room hundreds of times, possibly thousands, and he understood now, with the slow, ungraceful understanding of a man encountering his own obliviousness from the outside, that the chair had never been empty before. There had always been someone in it. He had simply never looked long enough to see who. He went to find Farrow. This in itself was unremarkable. He went to find Farrow most mornings, but today he noticed, as he entered the East Corridor office, that Farrow was sitting at his desk with the aspect of a man in the middle of a task that was exceeding his abilities. There were letters spread before him in a pattern that managed to convey both volume and disorder, and Farrow's expression, when he looked up, had the particular quality of controlled agitation that competent men deploy when they are not, in fact, managing. Julian said, "The Blackthorn lease renewal." Farrow's eyes moved to the letters, then back. He said he would have it by Friday. Julian looked at the desk. He looked at Farrow. He thought about the week 2 months prior when the boundary matter in the north had been resolved with what he had called, with some confidence, sound judgment. He had attributed this to Farrow. He had done so without question, the way one attributes the resolved problem to the person standing closest to it. He said, "Who handled the correspondence while you were ill?" There was a pause, brief but present, the kind of pause that arrives when a question has landed somewhere unexpected. Farrow said, "Miss Voss assisted." Julian said nothing for a moment. "Assisted," he repeated. Farrow, to his credit, held still. He said, yes, she had managed the backlog, that she had also corrected the northern matter. He said this without embellishment, and Julian understood, because he was not a stupid man, only an inattentive one, that the correction was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He thanked Farrow. He left. He walked back through the East Corridor and up the main stairs and stood at the window of his study for some time, looking at the grounds below, where the gardeners were doing something to the path near the east gate. He thought about the staff review. He thought about the words sound judgment in his own voice. He thought about the table and the arc of senior staff, and the particular pleasure of a problem well solved. He thought about where Sera Voss had been standing. He could not remember. He searched for it, reached back through the week with the careful deliberateness of a man who has just realized he failed to notice something important. And he could retrieve the table, and Pharaoh's composed smile, and Helena mentioning the garden path. But Sera was not in the image. She was not there, except she had been. He understood that now. She was always there. He had just never looked. Helena was quiet at dinner. This was not unusual. Helena had moods, and they moved through the house like weather, and Julian had long since learned to read the atmospheric pressure of her silences and leave them alone. But tonight her quiet had a different quality. Absence rather than withdrawal. She ate. She answered his questions about the week with single sentences. She did not initiate. He said, "Carefully, how is your companion getting on?" Helena looked at him, not sharply. Helena rarely did anything sharply, but with an attention that suggested the question had surprised her. She said, "Sera has taken some time away." Julian kept his expression neutral. He asked how long. Helena said she wasn't certain. A few weeks, perhaps. She needed rest. Helena said this as if she were reading from a letter she had already put down. He asked if something had happened. There was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to mean yes, and I am deciding how much of it to give you. Then Helena said, I believe she was tired, and returned to her plate, and the conversation was over. He did not sleep well. He lay in the dark of his room, the room that occupied the north corner of Ashvern House and had windows on two sides, and was consequently either magnificent or relentless, depending on the season. And he thought, with a methodical discomfort, about the shape of the last 6 years. Sera Voss had come to Ashvern House in the autumn. He remembered the arrival, dimly. Helena had required a companion, the arrangement had been made, and a quiet woman in grey had appeared, and then simply become part of the architecture of his household. Present, peripheral, never inconvenient. He understood now that he had confused her competence for silence, and her silence for contentment, and her contentment for the complete picture of a person. When in fact what he had done, with the unthinking efficiency of a man accustomed to the world arranging itself around him, was simply fail to look. He had thanked Pharaoh, in front of her, for work she had done. He did not know, lying in the dark, with the windows showing the grey beginning of early morning, whether she had left because of that moment specifically, or whether it had simply been the moment that made the weight of everything else finally visible. He was beginning to understand that there was a difference between those two possibilities, that the distinction mattered. He was beginning to understand, too, that he was a man who had lived in a house for 7 years and not yet learned all of its rooms. The chair by the window was empty. He needed to know the name of the person who had sat in it. He already knew her name. That was not what he meant. He meant the rest of it, all the rest. Chapter 4. He drafted it on Thursday morning, which should have been his first indication that something was wrong with it. Thursday was the day Julian wrote practical correspondence, the kind that moved money or land or obligation from one column to another, terms of agreement, notices of decision, letters that existed to close matters rather than open them. Thursday had a purposeful, unsentimental quality that suited him, and it was in this spirit that he sat at his desk, drew a clean end sheet of paper, and began to write to Sera Voss. He wrote well. He had always written well, clearly, without excess, in the manner of a man who understood that precision was a form of respect. He told her that her absence had created certain administrative difficulties, that her management of the estate correspondence had demonstrated a capability that the household would benefit from formalizing, that he was prepared to discuss revised terms of engagement, an expanded role, a commensurate increase in her allowance, should she wish to return. He read it back. It was correct. It was fair. It contained an offer that most women in her position would consider generous. He sealed it and sent it before he could think further about it. Her reply arrived on Saturday. He recognized her handwriting from the correspondence. That neat, undecorated hand, and he opened the letter at his desk with the expectation of a woman who would accept, or perhaps negotiate, or at the very minimum express gratitude for the offer's consideration. He read it once, then he set it down and looked out the window for a moment. Then he read it again. "Your Grace, thank you for your letter. I have considered your offer carefully, as it deserves. I note that it is precise on several matters. The role, the terms, the nature of what the household requires. You have always been precise in this way, and I mean that without irony. It is one of the things I have genuinely admired. I also note that your letter contains no reference to the staff review of the 14th. No reference to the correspondence I managed during Mr. Farrow's illness. No reference to what was said in that room, to whom and in whose name. I do not raise this to cause difficulty. I raise it because I think you may not have noticed its absence from your letter, which is, perhaps, the most accurate summary of the situation I could offer. You have written to me about what the household needs. I understand that, but I find I cannot accept an offer that treats what happened as a practical matter to be resolved through revised terms, because it was not, in the end, a practical matter. I was useful to you for 6 years. I would like, before anything else, to be considered. Yours respectfully, Sera Voss. He read it a third time, then a fourth. There was a quality to it that he could not immediately name, not anger, not self-pity, not the careful performance of injured dignity that people sometimes deployed when they wanted something and needed leverage to get it. It was something quieter and more difficult than any of those things. It was, he realized, the tone of someone stating a fact. Someone who had looked at a situation from all sides, understood it completely, and was now simply reporting her findings. She was not asking him to feel guilty. She was not asking him to feel anything specifically. She was pointing at a gap in his letter, the way one points at a structural error in a document. Calmly, precisely, without drama, the gap was there. She had seen it. She was letting him know. You have written to me about what the household needs. He set the letter down. He had, in fact, written exactly that. He had written a letter about Ashvern House and what it required, and somewhere in the logic of that composition he had apparently concluded that this was the same as writing to Sera Voss. He had not noticed the difference. He was noticing it now, with an acuity that was not entirely comfortable. I was useful to you for 6 years. I would like, before anything else, to be considered. He stood up from the desk. He went to the window, always the window, that old habit, and stood looking at the grounds below, and thought about usefulness. He had structured his entire letter around it. Her usefulness, the household's need for it, the transactional logic of capability and compensation. He had offered her more money for more labor and called it a resolution. He had not written a single word about what she was owed. Not because he was cruel. He turned that stone over carefully, examined what was underneath. No, not cruelty. Something else. Something that sat more uncomfortably than cruelty, because it had no clean name, and could not be blamed on intention. He had not written those words because he had not yet, even in the privacy of his own mind, fully assembled the picture of what the 14th had been. What she had done before it, what she had witnessed during it. He had known the facts. Farrow had told him the facts, but he had processed them the way he processed most things, efficiently, at a distance, in the service of resolution rather than understanding. She had seen this. In 6 sentences, she had seen this completely. He went back to the desk. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper. He sat for a long time without writing anything, because the letter he had sent was the letter of a man who knew how to be in command of a situation. And what was required now was something he did not have a Thursday template for. What was required was the letter of a man who had made an error, not of management, not of administration, but of the more fundamental kind. The kind that happens not in what you do, but in what you fail to see. The kind that a capable, quiet woman in grey had now laid before him with perfect, devastating clarity. He thought about the words she had used, considered, not praised, not thanked, not rewarded, considered. He picked up the pen. He did not write about the household. He did not write about the terms. He began, for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, with something that was not a conclusion, something that was not already decided. He began with the 14th, with the room. With her name said to no one, in the space where her name should have been said aloud. He wrote until the light changed. Chapter 5, Helena found him in the library on Sunday. This was unusual. Helena did not often come to the library. She sent Sera for books, or had sent Sera, in the time when there had been a Sera to send, and her presence in the doorway had the quality of something deliberate. She was dressed simply, her hair arranged without its usual ornamentation, and she carried nothing in her hands, no letters, no needlework, no prop of purpose. She had come, Julian understood immediately, to say something. He set down his pen. She moved into the room the way she moved through everything, with the unhurried, particular grace of a woman who had learned very young that the world would wait for her. She chose the chair nearest the fire, not the one nearest him, and arranged herself in it with a composure that he recognized, after a moment, as its own kind of preparation. He waited, Helena said. She reorganized the Harwick correspondence files before she left. Julian said nothing. 3 years of misfiling, Helena continued, her voice carrying the mild, almost conversational tone she used when she was saying something that was not mild at all. She did it on a Sunday. I don't believe she told anyone. He looked at his wife. She was looking at the fire. She translated the letters from the Fontaine estate. Helena said, "You never asked her to." The solicitor's French was poor enough that 2 clauses of the original agreement were being misread. She noticed, she corrected it. She said at nothing, because she thought it would embarrass Mr. Beckett if it was made known. A pause. "We saved £1,400, Julian said carefully. "I didn't know." "No," said Helena, "that was rather the point of her." The fire shifted. A log settled. Helena was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she had been quiet since the ball. Not the atmospheric silence of her moods, but something more structural, as though she had been rearranging furniture inside herself and was waiting to see where everything landed. She said, "She used to bring me chamomile on the nights I couldn't sleep. Not every night, only when she could hear that I was still awake." Her voice was even. Precise as a seam, she never mentioned it in the morning. It wasn't part of her duties. She simply knew and did it and let it be ordinary. Julian looked at his hands on the desk. He was beginning to understand that Helena was not making a list. She was building something, each item placed, with intention, fitted against the others, and he was not entirely sure he was going to find the shape of it comfortable. He was correct, Helena said. "I have not been a good friend to her either. I want you to know I'm aware of that." She said it without self-flagellation, a plain acknowledgement, cleanly made. "But I am a different failure than you are, Julian." He looked up. She met his eyes for the first time since she'd entered the room. "I took her for granted because she was always there," Helena said. You took her for granted because you never once considered that she was a person who might require something in return. Those are not the same error." The room was very quiet. "Do you know what she asked me for?" Helena said, "in 6 years. What she requested, for herself as a personal thing, not on behalf of the household, not to smooth some arrangement for someone else." He did not answer. "She asked once if she might take a Tuesday afternoon in March to attend a lecture at the Whitmore Institute." Helena's voice was gentle. It was the gentleness of a surgeon. It was on botanical illustration. She had mentioned, I think, that she had studied it briefly before. She paused, before circumstances changed. She asked me with such qualification, such apology for the inconvenience. Helena stopped, composed herself by degrees. I said yes, of course, and I forgot by Wednesday that she had gone. Julian says nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make him sound like a man defending a position he no longer held. "She is not," Helena said, "an administrative problem. She is not a capability gap. She is not a correspondence function in need of a title. She let that sit. She is a woman who has quietly given the best of herself to a house that looked straight through her. And she did it with more grace than most people could manage. And she did it for 6 years, and I think she stopped not because she was weak, but because she finally decided that she was worth more than the version of herself that staying was making her." Julian stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He was aware that this was his habit. The window, the grounds, the outward gaze, as a way of processing what he didn't yet have language for. And he was aware, newly and not pleasantly, that it was also a form of leaving the room without moving. He stayed where he was. He said, "I have written to her." "I know," said Helena. "She told me." He turned. "What did she say?" Helena considered this with the care of a woman deciding how much of another woman's privacy was hers to give. She said that your letter was very thorough. In any other context, this would have been a compliment." "I am writing another," he said. Helena rose from the chair. She smoothed her dress once and moved toward the door with the same unhurried grace she had entered with, and paused in the doorway the way she sometimes did, in the unspoken theatrical awareness that a doorway was where the last thing was said. She said, "Julian," he looked at her, "when you write to her, and I think you should, find a human reason." Her voice was quiet, now final, not what the house needs, not what the estate would benefit from, not what arrangement would be mutually practical. She looked at him steadily, without judgment, which was somehow worse than judgment. "Tell her why you, specifically you, would have her back. And if you can't find that reason, then I would think carefully about whether you have any right to ask." She left. The library was very still. Julian stood at the window for a long time, looking at the grounds he had looked at 10,000 times, and asked himself a question he had never previously thought to ask. It was a harder question than he expected. It was also, he found, not a difficult one to answer. Chapter 6, he did not send word ahead. He considered it, sat with the idea on Friday morning, pen in hand, and then set the pen down because he understood, with a clarity that felt newly available to him, that a letter announcing his arrival was still a letter, still the managed distance of ink and paper, and the extra day it would take for her to compose herself into the version of herself that received correspondence from Ashvern House. He did not want that version. He had corresponded with that version. She was precise and correct and entirely impenetrable. And he was beginning to understand that this was not her nature, but her armor, assembled specifically for him because he had given her no reason to put it down. He borrowed a coat from his estate manager, plain, wool, dark, without the particular cut that announced consequence, and he rode out on Saturday morning before the household was fully awake. The village of Calworth was 12 miles east of Ashvern, which he had known in the abstract, the way one knows measurements on a map. Riding it made it real, made the distance a thing with texture and duration. Frost-hardened road, bare hedgerows, a sky the color of unpolished pewter that sat low over the fields and did not move. Helena had given him the address without comment. One sentence, written on a card, passed across the breakfast table with the air of someone handing over a thing that had better be used well. The cottage was at the edge of the village proper, a narrow, decent house, on a lane that turned to mud at its far end. There was a garden, winter-stripped but tended. Someone had planted bulbs along the path, their papery tops just breaking the soil. He noticed this in the way he had been noticing things lately, with a new, uncomfortable attentiveness, as though some adjustment had been made to the lens through which he observed the world. He knocked. The pause before she opened the door was long enough that he thought she might not. Long enough that he prepared, briefly, and without quite meaning to, for the specific humiliation of standing in the mud outside a cottage she had chosen over his house. Then the door opened. She looked at him. Not with shock. He suspected very little shocked Sera Voss, but with a contained, careful attention to the way one looks at something that requires accurate assessment before any response is committed to. She was in a plain dress, dark blue. Her hair was down in a way he had never seen, simply arranged. She looked, he thought, like herself. He did not know what he had expected. Something diminished, perhaps, in the way that people who leave large houses sometimes appear diminished in small ones. But she was not diminished at all. She said, "Your Grace," he said, "I should have written to warn you." Then, before she could agree, "I didn't want to give you the opportunity to prepare for me." A beat of silence. Something moved behind her eyes, not warmth, not yet, but a kind of alertness, as though a door inside her had shifted fractionally on its hinge without opening. She said, "I see." She did not invite him in. She did step outside, pulling the door mostly closed behind her, and stood on the narrow path with her arms loosely folded. Not defensively, but in the way of someone who has decided to give a limited portion of her warmth to the cold air and no more. He did not reach for the practical thing. He had learned at some cost what the practical thing produced. He said the botanical lecture at the Whitmore Institute. Helena mentioned it. She went very still. "You studied illustration," he said, before your circumstances changed. And then you spent 6 years in a house with one of the finest private collections of botanical reference in the county. And I don't believe anyone ever once thought to mention that to you, or ask whether you'd like access to it. The stillness in her had a different quality now. "I am not raising this," he said carefully, "as an inducement. I'm raising it because it is one specific, concrete way in which I failed to see you. And I want you to know that I see it now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That is better than your letter." The bar was not high. "No," she said, and something loosened almost imperceptibly at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't. He told her about the staff review. Not the administrative version, not Pharaoh's name, not the boundary matter in the north, but the version that had kept him awake 3 nights running, the version in which he stood at the center of a room and said, "Good man," to someone who had received credit for her work, and had done so with the unexamined confidence of a man who had never seriously entertained the possibility that the most capable person in the room might also be the one he'd looked through. He said, "I did not intend it." She said, "I know." He said, "I'm not certain that makes it better." She said, "It doesn't." A pause. "But it is the more honest thing to say, so I'll give you credit for it." The wind came up the lane. She did not move. He said, "What was the worst of it?" "For you, if you're willing." She looked past him for a moment, down the lane, toward the place where the road curved out of sight, and he had the sense of someone measuring how much truth the moment could hold. She said, "It was not what you said in that room. It was that you believed it." Her voice was even, not angry. The evenness was more precise than anger. You thanked him, and you meant it, and it never once occurred to you to question it. That is not a mistake made in a moment. That is the shape of how you had been seeing, or not seeing, for a very long time. He did not defend himself. She looked back at him, and he held it, her gaze, the full weight of it, without retreating to the window or the grounds, or any of the habitual distances. He said, "Yes, just that." She studied him for a moment longer. The bulbs along the path caught a thin thread of winter light. She said, "You should come inside. You'll want tea before the ride back." She opened the door. He followed. Chapter 7. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Of course it did. Sera Voss had always understood the rhythm of Ashvern House better than anyone inside it, and whether she had chosen Tuesday deliberately, or whether it was simply the day that suited her, the effect was the same. Tuesday was the day the house paid attention. Tuesday was the day things were received and assessed, and filed into the estate's long memory. She had written to Helena. This was the first thing Julian noticed when Helena handed it to him. Without preface, without expression, simply extending the letter across the sitting room, with the steadiness of someone who had already absorbed its contents, and was now waiting to observe what it did to someone else. He noticed the address, Her Grace the Duchess of Ashvern. Not him, not the estate, not the administrative courtesy of a dual address that would have softened the choice into something logistical. Helena. Specifically, deliberately, only Helena. He read it standing. It was a short letter. Sera wrote the way she did everything, without excess, without performance. She thanked Helena with a warmth that was genuine and specific, in the way that only real attention can be specific. She named things, the French novels, the chamomile, the particular quality of the east sitting room light in autumn that they had both remarked upon once, on a morning neither of them had likely expected the other to remember. She said she hoped Helena would be well. She said it as though she meant it as a life's wish, not a social formality. And she said that she had accepted a position in Edinburgh, a household there, a family of some scholarly standing, whose daughter required both a companion and a French tutor. She would depart within the fortnight. She had enclosed the address, should Helena wish to write. She had not enclosed it for any other purpose. This was not stated. It did not need to be. The letter ended with yours, with genuine affection, and it was the most precise sentence in the document, and Julian understood it completely. The boundary it drew, the warmth it preserved on one side of that boundary, and the door it closed, quietly but completely, on the other. He read it twice. Then he set it down on Helena's writing table, with the care of a man setting down something that has become, without his permission, heavy. Helena was watching him from the chair by the window, that chair, the one that faced the morning light, and her expression had the quality it sometimes took on when she was being, as she occasionally was, entirely patient with his pace of understanding. He said, "Edinburgh." Helena said yes, he said, within the fortnight. So she says. He looked at the letter again without picking it up. At the handwriting, that neat, undecorated hand that had addressed 17 letters in a single night, and corrected a £1,400 error without telling anyone, and written him the most precise accounting of his own failure that he had ever received. He said, "Can I stop her?" The question arrived before he had fully decided to ask it, which was becoming, he noted distantly, something of a pattern. He was saying things before he managed them lately, arriving at feelings before he had properly organized them. It was disorienting in the way that any new terrain is disorienting, the ground behaving differently than expected, the footing less certain than it had always been. Helena was quiet for a moment. Then she said no. He looked at her. She has accepted a position, Helena said. She has made a decision. She has written to inform me of it as a courtesy, because that is who she is. Even now, even in leaving, she is courteous to the people she cares for. Her voice was measured, not unkind. The kindness was in the precision, actually, in not letting him arrive at a comfortable misreading. She did not write to you, Julian, he said. I know. She did not ask a question, Helena continued. She did not leave a door open that requires closing. She wrote a letter of conclusion, not of negotiation. He moved to the window. He caught himself, recognized the direction of his feet, and stopped in the middle of the room instead. He stood there in the open space of it, without the glass between himself and the grounds, without the habitual distance. He said, I went to Calworth. I said the right things. Some of them, Helena agreed. I thought... He stopped, considered the thought honestly before finishing it. I thought it was a beginning. Helena looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read, and then he could, and it was worse than he expected. It was compassion. Not the removing kind, the kind that sees clearly and stays anyway, she said. I think perhaps it was. For you. A pause, gentle as a closed door. But she has had a very long time to reach her own conclusions, and she reached them before you arrived in Calworth. And a single afternoon, however genuine, is not the same as 6 years of being made to feel like a function rather than a person. The fire, the sitting room, the letter face up on the table with Edinburgh written in it like a direction. You asked her to come back to a house where she was invisible, Helena said. She has chosen instead to go somewhere new. Somewhere that does not yet know to look through her. She tilted her head slightly. That is not a failure of your efforts in Calworth. It is rather the point she has been making since the beginning. Julian said nothing. He looked at the letter. He thought about the cottage path and the winter bulbs and the door that had opened, cautiously, provisionally, and the tea that had been made and drunk in a sitting room that smelled of wood smoke and paper, and the conversation that had moved, haltingly but genuinely, toward something real. He had believed it was the beginning of something. He understood now that for Sera it may have been the conclusion of something else entirely. The final proof of a question she had been asking for 6 years. Not will he see me? She had answered that already. But something harder, something quieter. Can I leave without bitterness? He thought, looking at the letter, that she could, that she had. He thought that this was, in its way, the most complete thing she had ever shown him. He picked up the letter. He read it one more time. Then he set it down and looked at Helena and said, I'd like the Edinburgh address. Helena studied him for a long moment. She said, Why? He said, Because I have something left to say. And because she deserves to choose whether she reads it. Helena looked at him, the full, unhurried look of a woman who has known a man for 7 years, and is seeing, for possibly the first time, a version of him she had not previously met. She gave him the address. She did not tell him it would work. That was rather the point. Chapter 8. He did not borrow the coat this time. He came as himself, his own horse, the particular bearing of a man who has decided that the management of appearances is no longer the point. It was Thursday evening, 4 days before her departure, and the sky was doing something vast and unresolved in the west, copper bleeding into grey at the horizon, the kind of sky, without asking, and demands to be looked at. He had written ahead this time, a single line. I am not coming to ask anything of you. I would like an hour if you are willing to give it. She had written back in 2 words. Come Thursday. The cottage was lit from within when he arrived. Warm light in the window. The particular gold of candles rather than lamps. And the garden path looked different in the early dark, the bulbs invisible now, beneath the soil, present only as a fact you had to already know. She opened the door before he knocked. She had known the sound of the horse, perhaps, or simply the hour. She stood in the doorway with a composure that was not armor, he thought. Or perhaps it was, but a different kind. Not assembled against him specifically, just the natural posture of a woman who had spent a fortnight becoming, quietly and deliberately, someone who did not need anything from him, she said. "You came," he said. "I said I would." She stepped aside, he entered. The sitting room was small and unhurried, with books stacked in the practical way of someone who reads rather than displays them, and a fire that had been burning long enough to have settled into its own rhythm. 2 chairs. A table with a teapot already waiting. He noticed all of this. He noticed it the way he had been noticing things lately, as evidence, as the accumulated proof of a person. They sat. She poured. She did not fill the silence with anything which he had come to understand was not indifference but a form of respect. She was giving him the room to begin. He began. He said, "My father died when I was 19. She looked at him. She did not say she was sorry. She simply listened with the whole of her attention, in the way that some people listen and most people only approximate. He was not, Julian said, a warm man. He was a capable man, a just man by most measures. He managed the estate with considerable skill, and he expected that I would do the same, and beyond that he paused, finding the exact shape of it. Beyond that, I don't believe he thought there was much else required, of himself or of me. He looked at his hands. I married Cecily. 3 years later, the name arrived in the room and settled there. He had not said it aloud at Ashvern Inn. He could not remember how long. It had become one of those words the house simply did not speak. By unspoken agreement, the way houses accumulate silences around the things that hurt. She was very alive. That is the truest thing I can say about her. She laughed at things I hadn't thought to find funny. She argued with me about the management of the East Fields, and she was right, and she knew it, and she told me so without softening it. Sera was very still. She died 14 months after we married. He said it the way it was, plain, without preparation, because there was no way to prepare a sentence like that. A fever. It was very fast, and He stopped. He had managed this part before, had summarized it, when it was required, in the measured tones of a man accounting for an event. He had never said the next part, not to Helena, not to anyone. He was not entirely certain he had said it to himself. I decided, he said slowly, that it would not happen again. Not that specific loss, necessarily, but that particular exposure, the particular vulnerability of having allowed someone to matter in that specific way, where their absence could restructure everything, change the dimensions of the rooms. He looked at the fire. I don't think I made this decision consciously. I think I simply became someone for whom the managing of things was the same as the living of them. And I was very good at managing things, and so it was easy not to notice what I had arranged myself out of. The fire shifted. Somewhere outside, the wind, he said, I did not see you, Sera. For 6 years I did not see you, and I have been trying to understand why, and I think it is this. I had organized myself into a man for whom seeing people, truly seeing them, had become something I no longer trusted myself to do, not because I thought nothing of you, but because I had taught myself to think nothing of anyone. And you were simply the clearest evidence of the cost of that. He stopped. He was not managing the outcome. He had promised himself he would not. He sat with what he had said and let it exist without shaping what came next. Sera set down her cup. She looked at him for a long time in the candlelight, and he did not look away, and the room held them both in it. The fire, the books, the 2 chairs, the evening, doing its slow work outside. She said, "That is the first truly honest thing you have ever said to me." He said, "I know. I'm sorry it took so long to get here." "So am I," she said it without cruelty, without even sadness exactly, with the plain, full recognition of something true. "But I'm glad you said it." He nodded. They sat in the quiet for a while, and the quiet was not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who have said the real thing and are letting it settle into the room like the heat from the fire, present, unglamorous, and genuine. He did not ask her to stay. He had promised he wouldn't, and he kept it. This was, he understood, perhaps the first promise he had kept that cost him something real. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He paused on the threshold, the cottage behind her, the dark lane ahead, and he said, "I hope Edinburgh is everything that Ashvern wasn't." She looked at him, and something in her face, something careful and long-held, briefly, quietly, let go. She said, "I'll write to Helena." He said, "I know." He walked down the path. The bulbs were under the soil. He could not see them. He knew they were there. He rode home through the dark and did not look back. And for the first time in a very long time, the not looking back was not a habit. It was a choice. Chapter 9. Edinburgh arrived the way new places do when you have chosen them deliberately, all at once, and then slowly. The city was cold in a way that Ashvern's countryside had never quite managed. A different cold. Purposeful. It came off the stone of the closes, and the long grey reach of the high street, and the castle sitting above everything like a thought that refused to be finished. Sera stood at her window on the first morning and looked at it, and felt, for the first time, in longer than she could clearly trace, that the view belonged to no one she was required to manage it for. It was hers, simply because she was standing in front of it. She exhaled. The Fairweather household was exactly what had been promised. Scholarly, slightly disorganized, fundamentally kind. Professor Fairweather was absent-minded, in the charming way of men, who are genuinely preoccupied with ideas, rather than performing preoccupation with them. His daughter Margot was 16, curious, and spoke French with an enthusiasm that far outpaced her accuracy. She reminded Sera in certain lights of no one she had known before, which was, she found, a relief. She made herself useful, but differently now, consciously. She understood her own labor in a way she had not permitted herself to before. Could feel the edges of it, where it began and where it ended, and could say, with increasing steadiness, "That is not mine to carry." It was harder than it sounded. 6 years is a long time to practice a particular diminishment. The habits of invisibility do not dissolve simply because the house changes. She caught herself, some mornings, moving through the Fairweather rooms with the apologetic efficiency of a woman trying not to take up space, and she would stop, deliberately, and make tea in the unhurried way of someone who is allowed to be exactly where she is. She was working on it. She wrote to Helena. Helena wrote back. Longer letters than Sera had expected. Warmer, with a frankness that had not been available to them inside Ashvern's particular architecture. Distance, Sera discovered, had made Helena honest in the way that proximity had not quite permitted. She wrote to no one else. The first letter from Julian arrived 6 weeks after her departure. She recognized the handwriting before she turned it over. Precise, controlled, the hand of a man who had been well taught and had never unlearned the discipline of it. She stood in the narrow hallway of the Fairweather house and held it for a moment without opening it. Then she took it to her room, sat at her desk, opened it. It was not a practical letter. It was not about the estate, or a position, or the terms of any arrangement. It was, she read it twice to confirm this, simply an account of a Tuesday. A specific Tuesday, 3 weeks prior, in which he had reviewed the correspondence himself, discovered a misfiling in the Blackthorn lease records, and spent an afternoon correcting it. He wrote that the correction had taken him 4 hours. He wrote that he had found, behind the misfiled papers, a survey document that had been missing for 2 years. He wrote, "I thought about what it would have taken you to see it. I think you would have found it in 20 minutes. I also think you would not have mentioned it to anyone." And then, at the end, with no transition, "I hope Margot's French is improving. I hope you are well." She sat at the desk for a while. Then she wrote back, 4 months of letters, not managed, not composed toward an outcome. Simply correspondence in the original sense of the word. 2 people writing to each other across distance, discovering in the space between send and reply that they were, in fact, interested in what the other had to say. He wrote about his father more than once, not with the careful surgery of the cottage evening. Those revelations had already been made, but in the offhand way of someone who has named a thing and found that naming it has made it possible to reference without flinching. Small mentions. My father would have handled this with considerably less uncertainty than I am currently managing, and then I'm not sure that would have been the right way to handle it. She wrote about the botanical illustration. She had found a class, Thursday afternoons, a small studio near the university, a teacher with paint-stained hands, and an absolute intolerance for timidity in line work. She wrote that she had been told her initial drawings were too careful, that she was treating the subject as something to be rendered accurately rather than understood deeply. She wrote, "I found this both offensive and entirely correct." He wrote back, "I recognize this feeling." She laughed. She was alone in her room when she did it, and the laugh was small and genuine and belonged to no one else. She did not perform it. She did not moderate it. She wrote to tell him she had laughed. He wrote that this was the best thing he had read in several months, and she understood from the way he wrote it, without ceremony, without managing what it revealed, that he meant it simply. She wrote that she had begun to look forward to Tuesdays again. He wrote, "So have I, though I find they require considerably more effort without you." She read this in the Fairweather sitting room, while Margot conjugated irregular verbs at the table nearby, getting most of them wrong with magnificent confidence. Outside, Edinburgh was doing what Edinburgh did, dark and brilliant, and entirely itself the castle above it all, lights coming on, one by one in the closes below. She folded the letter. She placed it with the others in the drawer of the writing desk, where they had accumulated over 4 months into something she had not planned for. A record, an archive, the history of 2 people learning, with considerable difficulty and genuine effort, how to be known. She picked up her pen. She began. Chapter 10. The letter that came on a Friday was not from Julian. It was from Dr. Pemberton, the Ashvern household physician, who wrote in the careful, compassionate brevity of a man who had delivered this kind of news before, and had learned that the kindest form of it was the shortest. The Duchess Helena had suffered a rapid decline, pneumonia, swift and without mercy. She had passed on Wednesday evening quietly in her own room. He wrote that Her Grace had asked, in her final days, that Miss Voss be informed directly. Sera read it at the Fairweather breakfast table. She read it once. Then she folded it along its original creases with a steadiness that was not composure so much as the body's mercy, the way shock in its first minutes holds everything very still. Margot looked up from across the table and said nothing, which was exactly right. She packed that afternoon. She moved through it practically, efficiently, in the old way, and then caught herself and stopped in the middle of the room with a folded dress in her hands and simply let the grief be the size it actually was. Not managed, not organized toward function. Helena had brought chamomile on difficult nights. Now there was no one to bring it to. She cried without performing it, in the plain, ungraceful way of real things. And then she finished packing, and she took the morning coach south. Ashvern House in winter had a particular quality she had forgotten. The way the pale stone absorbed the light of short days and gave nothing back. The way the grounds went silver and severe. The formal gardens stripped to their architecture. She had spent 6 years learning every variation of this view. She had not expected it to feel like grief in its own right. The household received her with a quiet that was different from the quiet she remembered. Not the quiet of managed distance, something thinner, more honest. People spoke to her directly, met her eyes, said her name, without the flattening courtesy of someone addressing the companion, rather than the person. She understood that something had changed here too. She did not yet know its full shape. The funeral was small, as Helena had apparently requested, which was, Sera thought, entirely like her. Helena had always understood that intimate things lost something in the scaling up. She stood at the graveside and said goodbye in the way you say goodbye to someone who taught you, without intending to, that you were worth more than you had been asking for. She said it silently. She meant it completely. Julian found her in the library. Or he did not find her exactly. She had gone there deliberately, in the hour after the funeral, when the house filled with guests and low conversation, and the particular social machinery of collective mourning. The library had always been where she went when the performance of a thing became too heavy. She had forgotten until she was standing inside it how much she had loved this room. The books, the particular quality of the afternoon light through the south windows, the smell of old paper and binding glue, and something underneath both of those things that was simply time. Years of it, accumulated, unjudged, patient. She was standing at the shelves when she heard the door. Julian closed it quietly behind him. He crossed the room without hurry and stopped several feet away, which was the right distance. He had learned, she thought, the right distance. He looked, she noticed, different. Not dramatically. He was still precise, still contained. But there was something in his bearing that had loosened at some structural level, the way a house looks different when a load-bearing tension has finally been released. He looked like a man who had been, over a long, quiet season, doing difficult interior work. He said, "I'm glad you came," she said. "I loved her. I know." A pause. "She loved you." She said so. She was not always a woman who said so. The light moved. Outside, somewhere in the house, voices rose and fell. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask you," he said, slowly, with the care of a man choosing each word because it matters and not because it sounds right. "If you would consider staying, not in any official arrangement, not as a companion or a secretary or anything the house requires." He stopped, found the next part. "As yourself, as the person I have been writing to for 4 months, who is the most genuinely known I have felt by another person since." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I don't know what you'll say." He said this plainly, without engineering it toward an answer. "I want you to know I'm aware of that. I'm not asking because I believe the outcome is settled. I'm asking because it is what I want, and because you deserve to be asked by someone who understands the difference between those two things." Sera looked at him for a long time. She thought about Edinburgh, about the Thursday illustration class, about Margot's gloriously inaccurate French, about the drawer of letters in the writing desk, and what they had built between them over 4 months of genuine attention. She thought about the question he was not managing, the outcome he was not arranging, the space he was leaving genuinely open. She said, That is the difference, isn't it? That you don't know. He said, yes. She said, good. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She turned back to the bookshelves, and after a moment, he came to stand beside her, and they stood together in the old room with its accumulated years and its south-facing light, not yet knowing what came next. That was, she thought, exactly right. The window held the winter sky. Somewhere beneath frozen ground, things were waiting to become. Sera spent 6 years being useful to a house that never quite looked at her, and still she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because somewhere underneath the invisible labor and the quiet humiliation, she kept believing that people were capable of more than they were currently managing, that seeing was a skill, that it could be learned. She was right. I think about her a lot. The real Seras. The ones in every office, every household, every room, who do the work that holds everything together and leave before anyone thinks to ask their name. And I think about what it takes to become the kind of person who finally, imperfectly, looks. Did you love Sera and Julian's journey? If their story of quiet invisibility and hard-won seeing, of a man learning to look, and a woman finally choosing to be found, touched something in you, subscribe now for more emotionally immersive aristocratic romance stories. Each tale brings you into worlds of candlelit libraries and frostbitten country estates, where guarded dukes meet women who refuse, eventually to disappear, where years of silence finally break into honesty, where love is not declared in grand moments, but built slowly, imperfectly, in letters and doorways and rooms that remember everything. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.